The Greenprint. Chapter 1. The Ghost in the Gears. The rain in North Fork, Oregon didn't just fall, it descended, a thick gray curtain of sound that made the world feel small and sodden. Elara Chen didn't mind the rain. Back in San Francisco, rain meant traffic jams and a $15 surge charge for a shared ride. Here, it meant the deep, satisfying soak of the earth, the smell of damp pine needles and ancient cedar, and the comforting percussion against the century-old corrugated metal roof of the building she now owned. The building, known locally and rather ominously as the Old Mill, was an architectural monument to North Fork's deceased past. For 80 years it had processed timber, giant Douglas firs and hemlocks, through screaming circular saws and conveyor belts that rattled the windows of the entire valley. When the last mill closed 5 years ago, it left a void that swallowed jobs, people, and hope, leaving behind just a high school football team that never won and a lot of empty storefronts. Elara had bought the skeleton of the operation for a song, a fact that everyone in town, especially Deputy Mayor Thorne, reminded her of with a condescending, knowing grin. They assumed she was an idiot, a rich city kid looking for a quirky investment that would fail in 6 months. They didn't know she was betting her entire future and the contents of every savings account she had ever opened on making the Old Mill the epicenter of North Fork's resurrection. She was installing a vertical farm, not just any farm, but a 3-story, climate-controlled, AI-optimized hydroponic system designed to grow hyper-local, nutrient-dense produce, a greenprint for the post-agricultural world. It was 9:47 p.m. on a Friday night. The mill was cold, the air thick with the smell of mold and residual sawdust. Elara, wearing heavy-duty work gloves and a Carhartt jacket that smelled faintly of diesel, was wrestling with a 50-pound industrial water pump. "Come on, you geriatric beast," she muttered, applying the last turn to a massive brass fitting. The pipe was a remnant of the mill's original fire suppression system, too thick to replace, too old to trust. She needed it to manage the initial water recycling loop. A single bare bulb suspended from the 20-foot ceiling cast a harsh, yellow light, making her shadow stretch and warp across the vast concrete floor. Her phone was dead, charging upstairs in the makeshift office. She was alone. The pump settled with a dull, resonant thud. She straightened up, wiping a streak of grease from her temple with the back of her wrist. The silence, broken only by the relentless rain, pressed in. She moved quickly to the temporary circuit panel she'd installed. This was the moment of truth. If the pump shorted, she'd lose the entire test batch of nutrient solution she'd mixed. If it worked, she would have pressurized the first 200 feet of her future irrigation system. Don't listen to Thorne. Don't listen to the guys at the hardware store who laughed. This is solid engineering. You built the code for this. She slammed the main breaker. A sharp crack instantly split the silence. Not a surge, but the sound of something heavy hitting the metal framework above her head. The single light bulb flickered violently, then settled into a shaky, buzzing hum. Elara froze. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She wasn't just working in an old building. She was working in the ghost of a building. Every local had a story about the ghost of the old sawboss, Jasper, who hated change and was said to be the reason for every mechanical failure since the closure. "Jasper, if that's you, I'm growing kale and heirloom tomatoes, not clear-cutting the watershed. Go haunt the tourism committee." She waited, listening intently over the rain. Nothing. She approached the pump cautiously. It was humming, a low, mechanical growl of success. It's running. The noise of the crack must have been a branch hitting the roof, or maybe a piece of rusted bracket giving way under the wind load. Anything but a ghost. A wave of intense, exhausted relief washed over her. She had done it. The infrastructure was alive. She walked back, heading for the winding, rickety staircase to her office, mentally running through the next day's checklist. Calibrate the pH sensor, write the data logging module, call the lumberyard about the structural reinforcement beams. As she reached the bottom step, she saw it. Resting right in the middle of the main bay, where she was planning to install the first 40-foot hydroponic rack, was a piece of wood. Not sawdust, not a splinter, but a thick, smooth, perfectly cut section of old-growth cedar, the kind that hasn't been legally logged in Oregon for decades. It was about 2 feet long, impossibly heavy, and covered in a thick layer of dust that matched the floor. But the dust was disturbed. Scrawled into the top of the wood with a thick, dark carpenter's pencil were 3 words: "Leave well enough alone." Elara stood still, the scent of fresh pine sap suddenly overriding the mill's musty air. This wasn't a warning from a ghost. This was a warning from a neighbor. She picked up the cedar block. It was exquisitely heavy, smooth to the touch, and ancient. It spoke of a craftsmanship, a relationship with the forest that her high-tech, soil-less operation fundamentally rejected. This wasn't just about a pump and a pipe. It was a cultural war in miniature, the digital future versus the timber past, efficiency versus tradition, the outsider versus the inherited right of the town. Elara squeezed the wood so hard her knuckles turned white under the grease. She walked over to the largest, dustiest window in the building, lifted the heavy cedar block, and hurled it through the glassless, empty sash, watching it disappear into the soaking night. She took a deep breath, the cold, damp air stinging her lungs. "This," she whispered to the empty, echoing bay, "is well enough, and I'm going to make it better." Elara had left Silicon Valley 2 years prior, burnt out on VC funding cycles and the moral vacuum of optimizing ad clicks. She'd been a senior data engineer, good at her job, well paid, but spiritually empty. The moment she realized her AI model could perfectly predict when a user was most vulnerable to buying a product they didn't need, she quit. She had spent the next 18 months studying, researching, and eventually formulating the Greenprint, a sustainable food production model that utilized 95% less water than traditional farming, 0 pesticides, and could thrive in any climate or in the shell of any defunct industrial building. North Fork hadn't been her first choice, but it was the best deal. The town sat on an aquifer fed by the coastal mountains, ensuring clean, plentiful water. The mill structure, while decrepit, was seismically sound and had the necessary height for 3 vertical tiers of growth racks. Critically, it was zoned industrial, which streamlined the permit process slightly. The biggest hurdles were never technical. They were human. Deputy Mayor Dale Thorne was the town's living embodiment of the inertia she was fighting. Dale was a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s, his face perpetually tanned from a lifetime spent outdoors, now frowning indoors over paperwork. He ran the planning committee, owned the only local contracting company that mattered, and was a walking memorial to the good old days. Elara's meeting with him the following Monday morning felt less like a permit review and more like a parental interrogation. "Miss Chen," Dale said, leaning back in his squeaky faux leather chair, crossing his massive arms over his chest. He didn't offer her coffee. "The application for the Commercial Food Production/Vertical Farm Initiative is, I gotta say, quite the novel." He tapped the thick stack of papers, Elara's 400-page business plan, engineering diagrams, and environmental impact study, with a thick, skeptical finger. It's the standard submission for an industrial modification, Mr. Thorne. All structural, environmental, and safety clearances are marked. Marked, sure, but I'm talking about, well, the spirit of the thing. You're asking to install a whole heap of high-wattage LED lights in a town that already pays the highest commercial electric rates in the county. My system uses high-efficiency spectral LED arrays, and the entire operation runs on solar power and a municipal grid tie-in. Elara countered smoothly, pulling up a digital projection on her tiny portable display. She was tired of explaining this. We grow food here, Miss Chen. We always have. We grow it in the dirt under the sun, like God intended. If people wanted salad grown in a warehouse with computers, they wouldn't live in Oregon. They also didn't want to watch the mill close, she shot back, instantly regretting the edge in her voice. Stay professional, don't engage the emotional argument. Dale's jaw tightened. The mill closed because the tree huggers and the market went soft, not because we lacked kale towers. He used the term kale towers with disdain usually reserved for politicians and ticks. North Fork needs jobs, Miss Chen. Real, year-round, skilled jobs. My operation will create 6 full-time positions, plant technicians, data analysts, and distribution managers, and we're committed to hiring locally and providing training. The average salary is 60% higher than the old timber wages. 6 jobs, he sniffed. The mill had 65. The mill paid for itself by depleting a resource. We pay for ourselves by regenerating one, and we don't pollute the river. We capture our runoff. We're an asset, not a liability to the watershed. He picked up a pencil, turning it over and over in his hand. It was a well-used short pencil, the kind loggers use to mark lumber cuts. Listen, Miss Chen, he said, finally making eye contact, his eyes a surprisingly clear, piercing blue. This isn't Silicon Valley. You can't just code a town to fix its problems. You got a lot of good, informative plans here, a lot of smart words, but you ain't got the community behind you. They see you, they see the mill, and they see some fancy bright light toy that's going to suck up the power, fail in a year, and leave us with a bigger tax problem than we had before. I'm not a tourist, Mr. Thorne. I sold my entire life to be here. I plan to succeed. But I need that temporary commercial occupancy permit to start hiring and installing the second phase. Dale sighed heavily, pushing the stack of papers back across the desk toward her. I can't approve this yet, Elara, he said, using her first name for the first time, which sounded less friendly and more paternalistic. There's a section missing, a demonstration, a proof of concept, you might call it. Elara felt a cold dread sink in her stomach. What section? I provided everything required by state and county code. The local addendum, subsection 4B, the community buy-in provision. It requires that any substantial industrial to commercial conversion must demonstrate, and I quote, a measurable and positive integration with existing local economic and civic structures prior to Phase 2 permitting. That's not state code. That's a loophole you invented. It was voted in by the council after the mill closure, Dale replied, a small, triumphant flicker in his eyes. We got tired of people coming in to film reality shows about abandoned buildings. You want to change North Fork, you got to prove your part of North Fork first. He leaned forward, lowering his voice conspiratorially. Here's the thing, Elara. You're smart. You're good with those fancy computers. You got a building that's got the bones, but you don't have trust. You're growing kale for millionaires in Portland, not feeding the people who live here. That's not true. I have a plan for... Plans are cheap. Action is expensive. The annual North Fork Harvest Festival is in 3 weeks. It's our biggest civic event. Everyone comes. The church, the school, the fire department, all the surviving businesses. I need you to prove your commitment. I need you to take on a meaningful role, something visible, something that shows you understand what this town values." Elara stared at him, calculating the delay. 3 weeks meant her financing deadline would be tight. She could feel the pressure closing in. "What role?" she asked, her voice tight. Dale gave a tight, satisfied smile. "The annual North Fork Harvest Bake-Off. It's been run by Mrs. Henderson since 1978, but she finally hung up her apron last year. It's tradition. It's community. You run the pie bake-off, and I'll put your permit renewal on the agenda for a special session the Monday after the festival. That's my condition."
Elara had built AI models, designed supply chain logistics for a multi-billion-dollar company, and wired industrial pumps in the dark. She had zero experience with pie crusts, community politics, or Mrs. Henderson. But she looked at the stack of plans, the dream that represented the past 2 years of her life, and knew she had no choice. She had to fight the ghost in the gears, whether it was Jasper's spirit or Dale Thorne's deep-seated skepticism. And sometimes you had to fight a technological battle with a wooden rolling pin.
"Fine, Mr. Thorne," Elara said, stacking her documents. "I'll run the pie bake-off, but I warn you, I intend to optimize the event for maximum efficiency, transparency, and judge experience." Dale laughed, a genuine, deep belly laugh that shook his chair. "You do that, Elara. You just bring us a great pie bake-off." As Elara walked out, the sound of his laughter followed her down the hall, echoing the warnings already scrawled in cedar. Chapter 2. The Algorithm of Apple Pie. Elara drove her ancient, mud-splattered Subaru back to the old mill that afternoon, the rhythmic swipe of the wipers matching the frantic, irritated rhythm of her thoughts. Pie bake-off. It was the antithesis of everything she stood for. She managed a 400-point data stream from her nutrient solution system: pH, electrical conductivity, dissolved oxygen, spectral absorption, all to maintain a perfect, predictable growing environment. Now she had to manage flaky crusts and county fair ribbons. She parked inside the main bay near the vertical rack frames. The massive cedar plank she'd thrown out the window earlier was nowhere to be seen, washed away or dragged off by the torrential rain. Good riddance. She needed to ground herself. She needed logic. Shedding her damp jacket, Elara pulled on safety glasses and headed straight for the half-finished control room built into the old saw foreman's office. She booted up the terminal connected to her prototype sensor array. On the screen, the data flowed, clean, objective, and beautiful. "Focus on what you can control," she muttered, clicking on the calibration sequence for the master pH sensor. The ideal pH range for her target greens, butter lettuce and arugula, was a tight 5.8 to 6.2. Deviation meant nutrient lockout, meaning the plants couldn't absorb minerals regardless of how much was in the solution. It was a precise, quantifiable problem. Find the baseline, calculate the variance, apply the counteragent. That was the algorithm for life and for lettuce. But the pie bake-off? It was a system with no defined inputs, opaque metrics, and judges who probably relied on feelings rather than a standard rubric. Dale Thorne knew exactly what he was doing, setting her up for a social lockout. She pulled out her laptop and searched her email for the pie bake-off rules. Thorne had forwarded her a single attachment, a blurry PDF simply titled NFHRFRLULES_final_1998.pdf. She opened it, The document wasn't a sleek, numbered PDF. It was a scanned, typewritten sheet stained with what looked suspiciously like coffee and blueberry juice. The rules were a baffling patchwork of prohibitions, traditions, and outright poetry. Rule 3. All pies must contain at least 2 components sourced within the North Fork watershed. The exception is sugar. White sugar is fine, brown sugar is better. Rule 7. Presentation matters, but flavor is the ultimate truth. Pies judged on the truth, 80%, the look, 10%, and the spirit of North Fork, 10%. Rule 10, critical. No frozen components, no store-bought crusts, no fancy European flair. We are here for honest American pie. If using an exotic fruit, a letter of explanation addressed to the judges panel must be submitted 72 hours prior to the festival. Signed, M. Henderson, Committee Chair, 1999. Elara sighed, running her hand through her short, practical hair. The truth metric was 80% of the score. What was the truth of a pie? Was it a function of the starch-to-sugar ratio, the Maillard reaction efficiency in the crust? It was unquantifiable. It was maddening. She realized she needed the source code, the unwritten protocols held by the woman's name who punctuated the document, Mrs. Henderson. Mrs. Myrtle Henderson lived in a tidy white Victorian house just off Main Street, surrounded by rose bushes that stubbornly bloomed even in the Oregon drizzle. The door was answered by Mrs. Henderson herself, a spry woman in her late 70s with silvery hair pulled into a neat bun, wearing a floral apron over a crisp blue dress. She was holding a wooden spoon, and the entire hallway smelled of cinnamon and beeswax. "You must be Elara," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice warm but her gaze surprisingly sharp. "Dale Thorne called, said you were handling the logistics this year." The emphasis on logistics was gentle but pointed. "That's right, Mrs. Henderson. I just wanted to introduce myself and, well, get the full documentation. The binder I have is a little sparse on the operational side." Mrs. Henderson smiled, a delicate creasing around her eyes. "Oh dear, the binder. I thought Dale kept the binder." She invited Elara into a sun-bathed kitchen where 2 ceramic cooling racks held 3 perfect golden brown apple pies. They were flawless, the crust edges crimped with a geometrical precision that Elara couldn't have replicated with a CNC machine. "The binder is less a set of rules, more a living history," Mrs. Henderson explained, setting down the wooden spoon. "It contains the last 40 years of judging notes, all the successful entries, and most importantly, the list of unacceptable innovations." Mrs. Henderson retrieved the said binder from a high shelf, a massive grease-stained object bound in peeling red vinyl. Elara's eyes widened when she opened it. Inside were not just rules, but anecdotes, hand-drawn diagrams, and photos of disastrous pies. "I was trying to understand Rule 7, the 80% weight for the truth," Elara said, flipping through a section titled Crust Failure, a Moral Issue. Mrs. Henderson poured 2 cups of tea, Earl Grey, strong. "The truth, dear, is simple. It's about honesty. Did you try to hide a poor filling with too much spice? Did you use a food processor when your grandmother used her hands? Did you buy those apples at the grocery store when the season is for pears?" Elara frowned. "So, it's about effort and tradition?" "It's about North Fork effort and North Fork tradition," Mrs. Henderson corrected gently.
The pie bake-off isn't a food contest. It's an evaluation of character baked into a 9-inch round. Elara felt the technical foundation of her world crumbling. Character? She hadn't factored character into her NPV spreadsheet. "I see," Elara said slowly. "And unacceptable innovations?" Mrs. Henderson flipped to a heavily marked-up section. "Ah, things that have been tried, things that have failed. We tried a key lime pie one year. No good. Too sour, too tropical. Someone tried a deconstructed pie in a jar. That's an immediate disqualification." A deconstructed pie? Elara felt a chill of recognition. That was precisely the kind of postmodern, optimized presentation a city person might attempt. "Dale Thorne asked you to do this, didn't he?" Mrs. Henderson asked, stirring her tea. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact. "He made it a condition of my Phase 2 permit."
Mrs. Henderson nodded sadly. "Dale loves this town. He also believes that people like you, smart, fast, wanting to turn old wood into new boxes, will run over our history without noticing. He wants you to stop optimizing, Elara. He wants you to notice." She gestured toward the window, where the small, wet town was visible. "You're making food, dear. That's human. That's tradition. That's the opposite of a computer screen. You can analyze data all day, but you cannot compute the memory of a grandmother's kitchen." Elara felt a strange mix of respect and despair. Mrs. Henderson wasn't an obstacle. She was an entire operating system, deep-rooted and immutable. "I have my own internal deadline," Elara admitted. "My financing is contingent on beginning the vertical rack installation within the next month. I need that permit." Mrs. Henderson placed a soft, warm hand on Elara's. "Then you need to win the community over, not the judges. Use your smarts, Elara, not to make the most complex pie, but to make the most North Fork pie." She paused, then added a final, devastating detail. "And you must use lard in your crust. Vegetable shortening is cheating. Butter is for croissants. We're in pig country, dear. Lard is tradition." Lard. The very word seemed heavy, archaic, and fundamentally unoptimized. Elara left the Henderson house armed with the binder, the smell of cinnamon clinging to her sweater, and a new, unsettling understanding. She had a system to reverse engineer, a community, not a machine. Back at the mill, Elara sat in the office, ignoring the blinking pH sensor warning on her monitor. She opened a fresh spreadsheet and titled the first column, "Pie Bake-Off, Variables and Uncertainties." The inputs were chaotic: lard content, undefined fat percentage; the spirit of North Fork, subjective historical data; apple variety, locally sourced, unknown sugar content. This wasn't a technical problem. This was a social engineering problem masquerading as a culinary competition. The failure of the mill had been a failure of community adaptation. The success of the Greenprint would rely on a working relationship with the town. Elara knew she couldn't simply build the best pie. She had to build the best process for understanding North Fork itself. She needed to treat the community as a complex, adaptive system, and the pie bake-off was the ultimate proof of concept. Her six-figure investment was riding on her ability to master the algorithm of apple pie. She picked up her phone. She needed to start her research, not on agricultural robotics, but on pigs. Specifically, the optimal method for rendering lard in a way that would honor the spirit of Mrs. Henderson, and maybe, just maybe, get her a perfect 80% score on the truth. Mrs. Henderson nodded sadly. Dale loves this town. He also believes that people like you, smart, fast, wanting to turn old wood into new boxes, will run over our history without noticing. He wants you to stop optimizing Elara. He wants you to notice. She gestured toward the window, where the small, wet town was visible. You're making food, dear. That's human. That's tradition. That's the opposite of a computer screen. You can analyze data all day, but you cannot compute the memory of a grandmother's kitchen. Elara felt a strange mix of respect and despair. Mrs. Henderson wasn't an obstacle. She was an entire operating system, deep-rooted and immutable. I have my own internal deadline. My financing is contingent on beginning the vertical rack installation within the next month. I need that permit. Mrs. Henderson placed a soft, warm hand on Elara's. Then you need to win the community over, not the judges. Use your smarts, Elara, not to make the most complex pie, but to make the most North Fork pie. She paused, then added a final, devastating detail. And you must use lard in your crust. Vegetable shortening is cheating. Butter is for croissants. We're in pig country, dear. Lard is tradition. Lard. The very word seemed heavy, archaic, and fundamentally unoptimized. Elara left the Henderson house armed with the binder, the smell of cinnamon clinging to her sweater, and a new, unsettling understanding. She had a system to reverse engineer, a community, not a machine. Back at the mill, Elara sat in the office, ignoring the blinking pH sensor warning on her monitor. She opened a fresh spreadsheet and titled the first column, Pie Bake-Off, Variables and Uncertainties. The inputs were chaotic. Fat content, undefined fat percentage. The spirit of North Fork, subjective historical data. Apple variety, locally sourced, unknown sugar content. This wasn't a technical problem. This was a social engineering problem masquerading as a culinary competition. The failure of the mill had been a failure of community adaptation. The success of the Greenprint would rely on a working relationship with the town. Elara knew she couldn't simply build the best pie. She had to build the best process for understanding North Fork. She needed to treat the community as a complex, adaptive system, and the Pie Bake-Off was the ultimate proof of concept. Her six-figure investment was riding on her ability to master the algorithm of apple pie. She picked up her phone. She needed to start her research, not on agricultural robotics, but on pigs. Specifically, the optimal method of rendering lard in a way that would honor the spirit of Mrs. Henderson and maybe, just maybe, get her a perfect 80% score on the truth. Chapter 3. The Lard Protocol. Elara spent the next 48 hours submerged in the least optimized, most charming corners of the internet. Historical cookbooks, homesteading blogs, and obscure Reddit forums dedicated to the pursuit of the perfectly rendered fat. Her control room, the nerve center of her hydroponic operation, had become a bizarre hybrid of data science lab and culinary research station. Her 34-inch ultra-wide monitor, which usually displayed spectral light curves and nutrient absorption rates, was now dominated by a massive, chaotic spreadsheet. Target metric, flakiness quotient, FQ. Variable, desired range, current status, acquisition path. Fat type, leaf lard, tallow. Fat rendering method, dry rendered, highest purity, wet rendered, higher yield, lower quality. Fat temp input, 4.5 to 6.0 degrees Celsius, crucial for flakiness. Flour moisture, 12.5% plus or minus 0.5%. Assume high ambient moisture, Oregon. Apple variety, tart, high pectin, Granny Smith equivalent. Needs local foraging or farm access, high uncertainty. The more she researched, the more the complexity grew. Lard was not a commodity, it was a craft. The quality depended on the pig's diet, the section of fat used. Leaf fat from around the kidneys was the best, and the slow, low heat of the rendering process. It was a thermodynamic puzzle, but the variables were biological and artisanal, not digital. Mrs. Henderson's rules demanded local sourcing. Elara ran a quick geo-query against publicly available Oregon agricultural records, cross-referencing farms within the North Fork watershed that raised heritage pork breeds. One name stood out: Crooked River Pigs and Produce. She drove out that afternoon, her Subaru bouncing along a gravel road that clung to the side of a steep, heavily wooded hill. The vertical elevation climb was punishing, but when she broke through the trees, the view opened up. A working farm nestled in a wide, sunny bench overlooking the Crooked River Valley. It was messy, vibrant, and alive, the antithesis of the mill's industrial decay. She found the owner, a woman named Elara Chen, hauling a heavy bag of feed across a muddy yard. Elara was younger than Elara expected, mid-30s, with hands permanently stained by earth and an expression that bordered on exhaustion and deep satisfaction. "Can I help you?" Elara asked, her voice tight with strain from the effort of the bag. Elara immediately went into solution mode. "I can calculate the optimal trajectory and torque-to-mass ratio for that load, but I'm going to assume you'd prefer I just help lift it." Elara paused, a bead of sweat tracing a line through the dirt on her cheek. She let out a short, bark-like laugh. "The load's going into the barn, city girl. Just hold the door open." Elara obliged. Once the heavy sack was dumped into a metal bin, Elara finally wiped her hands on her worn denim overalls and turned to Elara. "I got a call from Dale Thorne. Said the tech genius bought the mill and now needs my best fat to fix her reputation. That about sum it up?" Elara winced. Dale Thorne had wasted no time in spreading the word. "That's a concise summary, yes," Elara admitted. "My name is Elara Chen. I'm starting a vertical farm, and I need to participate in the Harvest Festival Pie Bake-Off to satisfy a rather particular permit requirement." "The community buy-in provision," Elara supplied dryly. "Dale wrote that one himself after the Seattle couple tried to turn the old general store into a vintage artisanal cooperative. They didn't even know what a tax stamp was." "I'm trying to honor the spirit of the rules. Mrs. Henderson was very clear that for the crust, it has to be local, quality lard. Specifically, leaf lard." Elara tilted her head, assessing Elara with the same critical eye Elara used to assess hydroponic sensor readings. "We raise Mangalitsa and Berkshire, heritage breeds. They put on good fat. We render dry, twice filtered. It's the highest quality you can get. You're talking about the best possible input for flakiness and flavor profile. And I'd like to purchase 5 pounds, Elara said, pulling out her wallet. Elara shook her head. "Can't do it. Not yet." Elara fell completely. "Why not? I can pay premium."
It's not about the money, Elara. It's about the process. We process pigs the first Wednesday of every month. I'm rendering tomorrow. And Rule 3, which Dale probably didn't mention, requires the 2 local components to be handled with respect for the tradition of the watershed. It's in the addendum, after the rule on pie tin size. Elara remembered the rule: at least 2 components sourced within the North Fork watershed. She had assumed buying the ingredients constituted sourcing. "What exactly do you need me to do?" Elara asked, resignation creeping in. Elara smiled, a genuinely warm and tired smile that softened the hard lines around her eyes. "You want the best leaf lard? You need to understand where it comes from. You need to be here tomorrow before dawn. You're going to help me separate the caul fat, dice the leaf fat, and monitor the rendering pot. It takes 6 hours, low and slow, or the purity is compromised." Elara swallowed hard. 6 hours of manual labor focused entirely on fat. Her project management software was already screaming at her about the lost time for pump recalibration. "And if I do this, I can buy the lard?"
No, Clara corrected. If you do this, you will have sourced the lard. You will have paid the price of admission, which is time and effort, not just cash. That's what they call the truth around here. Elara felt the familiar challenge of a complex, intractable system. It wasn't about optimizing data flow, it was about optimizing relationships and labor. She looked past Clara, toward the barn, where a few stout, curly-haired pigs snuffled contentedly in the mud. They were part of her permit now. "All right, Clara," Elara said, nodding once, a decisive motion. "What time is before dawn?" 4:30 a.m. Wear boots you don't mind getting dirty, and don't bring your spreadsheet. Bring curiosity. Elara drove back to the old mill, the image of the messy, vibrant farm burning brightly against the cold, sterile steel of her vertical farm racks. She spent the evening doing two things she never expected: recalibrating her high-tech pH sensor and then cleaning the dirt off her best pair of heavy-duty work boots. The boots smelled like grease and sawdust. Tomorrow, they would smell like pig. Chapter 4. The 6-Hour Kernel. Elara arrived at Crooked River Pigs and Produce at 4:39 a.m. The pre-dawn cold was immediate and absolute, cutting through her Carhartt jacket. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, wood smoke, and something primal and metallic. Clara was already inside a small, whitewashed workshop adjacent to the barn, stoking a massive cast-iron stove. The stove radiated a glorious, localized heat that made Elara instinctively gravitate toward it. "You're early," Clara said, glancing up from the firebox. She was wearing heavy leather gloves and a thick wool hat. "Optimal task initiation time is T-1 minute," Elara replied, rubbing her hands together. "The only timer we care about out here is the sun. Grab an apron and a knife." The counter was stainless steel, cold and clean, but piled high with pale, pearly fat. It was strikingly white, almost pure, draped around a complex, translucent membrane. This was the leaf lard, removed from around the kidneys, the most stable, flavor-neutral, and highly saturated fat available, perfect for the flaky crust she was chasing. "We're dry rendering," Clara explained, handing Elara a ridiculously sharp boning knife. "No water, no milk, purely the fat separating from the cell membranes. Your job for the next hour is dicing. We need pieces about the size of a dice. Uniformity is key. Too large, and it won't render evenly. Too small, and it burns." Elara, whose hands were trained to handle circuit boards and microscopic components, found the knife heavy and the fat surprisingly resistant. The cold enhanced the solidity of the fat, making the first few cuts clumsy. "This is a manual process, then?" Elara asked, frustrated by her inefficiency. "No industrial slicer?" "That would introduce friction and heat, compromising the molecular structure before rendering. It's about minimizing input trauma. The pig gave its best fat. We owe it our best effort." For the next 60 minutes, the only sound was the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of Elara's knife against the cutting board, the low roar of the wood stove, and the distant, muffled sounds of the waking farm. Elara forced herself to ignore the dull ache in her forearms and focus on the uniformity of the pieces. She wasn't cutting fat. She was creating a data set, a perfectly consistent input variable. When the fat was diced, Clara transferred the 30 pounds of cubed lard into a colossal, heavy-bottom stainless steel pot. Phase 2, the slow cook. The next 5 hours are about heat management. We need to hold the temperature precisely between 90 and 110 degrees Celsius. Too cold, and nothing happens. Too hot, and the fat scorches, giving it a toasted flavor, which is death to a perfect pie crust. Elara stared at the pot, mesmerized. It was an analog feedback loop, slow and subtle, depending entirely on human observation and learned intuition. She would have set up 3 temperature probes, a PID controller, and a variable heating element. Clara used her eyes and her ear. Clara handed Elara a long wooden paddle. "Stir it every 15 minutes. Always touch the bottom. We don't want hot spots. You're maintaining the thermal gradient. And so, Elara's day became a meditation on heat, time, and fat. Every 15 minutes she stirred, feeling the slow, heavy resistance of the melting cubes, observing the clear, luminous liquid pooling in the bottom of the pot. At the 2-hour mark, Elara realized why this process mattered. It wasn't just manual labor, it was a test of patience, the very quality Dale Thorne believed people like her lacked. She was used to millisecond latencies, to solving a problem and deploying a fix in the same hour. This required a 6-hour, continuous monitoring cycle, where the only tools were patience and persistence. "Why the dry render, Clara?" Elara asked during one of the stir cycles. "Purity. It minimizes the moisture content and maximizes the shelf stability. It's the difference between a high-grade industrial oil and a heritage product. It's about making sure your one variable, the fat, is absolutely perfect. No noise in the signal." No noise in the signal. The phrase was tech Varkener, but applied to lard, it meant tradition and purity. At 5 hours, the process changed rapidly. The liquid fat was now almost fully clear, like pale liquid gold, and the remaining solid pieces, the cracklings, were shrinking and turning a deep, rich gold. The sounds shifted from a gentle hiss to a faint, rhythmic pop. Clara leaned in, inhaling deeply. "Smell that? Clean, slightly sweet, no hint of smoke. It's done."
Clara moved with sudden speed, pulling the pot from the stove and carefully pouring the luminous liquid through a cheesecloth-lined sieve and into massive stone crocks. The resulting liquid was breathtakingly clear, almost scentless, and beautiful. "That," Clara said, pointing at the crocks, "is the kernel, the purest expression of the pig's diet and our labor. You successfully sourced your leaf lard." Elara stood back, exhausted, covered in a faint sheen of grease, but oddly energized. Her hands were sore, her jacket smelled like smoke, and she'd spent 6 hours doing something a machine could theoretically do faster, but never better. "What about the second local component?" Elara asked, pointing at her spreadsheet. "The apple variety is still the biggest uncertainty." Clara led her out of the workshop. The sun was fully up now, lighting the valley with a soft, misty glow. Clara pointed toward a distant, heavily overgrown section of the farm, tucked against a row of towering pines. "We have an old orchard, planted by my great-grandfather. It's mostly forgotten, disease-prone, inconsistent yield, but 2 trees survived the logging and the blight. They produce a small, intensely tart apple called the North Fork russet. It was bred to store well through a long Oregon winter." "Tart is good. High pectin, maybe?" Elara's optimization brain whirred back to life. "It's a pie apple," Clara confirmed. "But you can't buy them. They're not commercial. You have to pick them yourself. They're fragile." "Sourcing requires foraging," Elara translated, a grin cracking through the grease on her face. This was a new protocol. "You're learning the language, Elara," Clara said. "The lard is the fat input. The apples are the fruit variable. Now go calculate your sugar ratio, but don't forget the most important part of the truth metric. The process you just learned is the memory you're baking into the pie." Elara drove back to the old mill, 5 pounds of the finest, whitest leaf lard secured in a cooler. She had the first component, sourced by sweat and fire. The next task was to find the North Fork russets, and then to write the one piece of code she couldn't debug with a sensor, the recipe for the perfect, traditional, community-approved apple pie. Chapter 5. Pectin and Proof. The North Fork russet orchard was less an orchard and more a casualty of benign neglect, a thicket of brambles and tall grass where a couple of gnarled ancient trees struggled to thrive. Elara arrived with a ladder, a 5-gallon bucket, and a refractometer. She'd calibrated the refractometer,
a device that measures the sugar content, bricks, of a liquid to her lab standards. Her goal? Quantify the unknown variable. She couldn't control the tree, but she could model its output. The 2 surviving trees were magnificent in their age, their trunks thick and twisted like rope. The russets themselves were unremarkable to the eye, small, slightly lumpy apples with a rough brown-green skin. They were so different from the perfect uniform red delicious she was used to seeing. They were messy, inefficient, and beautiful. Elara set up the ladder and began carefully picking. Unlike commercial apples, which could withstand the decent tug, the russets detached almost at a glance, requiring delicate, two-handed retrieval. She quickly realized her hands, still stiff from dicing lard, were clumsy. After an hour, Elara had collected about 10 pounds of fruit, enough for 2 pies. She sliced one of the apples open with a paring knife. The flesh was shockingly white, firm and dense. She crushed a small piece, collected the juice, and applied it to the refractometer lens. She looked through the viewer, adjusting the focus. 7.2 bricks. She tested a second, slightly smaller apple, 7.1 bricks. A third, 7.3 bricks. High consistency, low sugar, Elara murmured, pulling out her phone to consult the comparison chart she'd hastily constructed. A typical Granny Smith, the industry standard for tart baking, runs at 9.0 to 11.0 bricks. A sweet eating apple like Honeycrisp is 13.0 to 15.0. The North Fork russet was intensely tart, sitting far outside the expected range. It was a perfect storm of low sugar and high acid, an ideal canvas for a pie filling, but one that demanded a precise counterbalance of sugar to ensure flavor integration without being cloying. Find the optimal sweet-to-acid ratio. Back at the mill, Elara set up her makeshift kitchen in the corner of the office. She had the purest leaf lard, the tartest apples, and a local bag of flour she'd bought from the general store. The only variables left were ratios and process. She organized her inputs. 1. Fat, Crooked River leaf lard, chilled to 5.0 degrees Celsius, guaranteed purity. 2. Fruit, North Fork russets, 7.2 bricks average, high tartness, high structure. 3. Stabilizer, local, all-purpose flour. 4. Sweetener, granulated white sugar for purity of data input. 5. Control, ice-cold water, lowering the water temp to 1.0 degrees Celsius. Elara designed the experiment, a 2x2 matrix testing different sugar-to-flour-to-water ratios for the crust and a separate variable for the filling. She would bake 2 pies, one traditional and one optimized. Pie A, the control, Mrs. Henderson's protocol. Crust, 2½ cups flour, 1 cup lard, 6 tablespoons of water. Standard forgiving ratio. Filling, 6 cups apples, 1 cup sugar, 2 tablespoons of flour, and 1 teaspoon of cinnamon, a typical unadjusted recipe. Pie B, the optimization, the Greenprint protocol. She used her knowledge of fat saturation and protein structures. Lard's high saturation meant less water was needed to prevent gluten formation. Algorithm, maximize fat-to-flour ratio while minimizing water. Ratio, 3 cups flour, 1.25 cups lard, 4 tablespoons of water. Targeting maximum flakiness by minimizing gluten development. Filling, based on the 7.2 bricks apple, she needed more sugar to balance the acid. Algorithm, use the acid-sugar balance formula. She estimated the malic acid content based on the russet's phenotype to calculate the precise sugar requirement. Ratio, 6 cups apples, 1½ cups sugar, 50% more than control, and 3 tablespoons of tapioca starch, a superior thickening agent to flour, minimizing opacity, and a custom blended spice mix, cinnamon, nutmeg, and a pinch of allspice. Elara had already broken one unwritten rule. Mrs. Henderson would judge the use of tapioca starch as a fancy European flair. But Elara was optimizing for the truth, 80%, and the truth, in a filling, meant a perfectly viscous sauce that held its shape when sliced. Tapioca starch was superior. The process of making the crust was agonizingly slow. She meticulously cut the cold leaf lard into the flour using a pastry cutter, stopping precisely when the mixture resembled pea-sized crumbs, a perfect analogy for her data points. She then added the ice-cold water droplet by droplet until the dough just barely came together. The kitchen timer, a digital one she'd brought from her hydroponics kit, was set for exactly 37 minutes, the ideal rest time for the dough, chilled in the mill's walk-in refrigerator, a remnant of its brief life as a mushroom farm. Elara assembled both pies with surgical precision, crimping the edges of pie B into a tight, geometrically pleasing rope, while pie A received the standard fork press treatment. She then scored 3 small vents into the top of each pie. The 2 pies went into the small convection oven she'd installed,
375 degrees Fahrenheit, 55 minutes, rotating at 30 minutes. Maillard reaction optimization engaged. She paced the cold office, unable to concentrate on her real work. Her entire reputation in North Fork and the financing for the Greenprint was riding on 2 pounds of heritage apples and a cup of pure rendered pig fat. When the timer went off, Elara pulled the pies out. Pie A, the control, was fine, golden brown, bubbling slightly, but the crimping had slumped a little. The crust was uneven. Pie B, the optimization, was stunning. The crust was a deep, even golden color. The crimping held its shape perfectly, and the subtle, nutty aroma of the leaf lard was unmistakable, combining with the intense apple spice. It looked, statistically speaking, perfect. Now, the final terrifying metric, the taste test. She let them cool for an hour, agonizing over the required settling time. She sliced pie A first. The slice came out easily, but the filling slumped slightly, a little runny. The taste was pleasant, traditional, but the high acid of the russets was only partially masked, and the crust, while acceptable, was slightly tough where she'd accidentally overmixed the water. Then, pie B. The knife sliced through the lard crust with a dry, flaky shh. The slice held its shape instantly, the tapioca starch having created a translucent, viscous sauce around the intact chunks of russet apple. The slice was architecturally sound. She took a bite. The crust was a revelation. Layers of flake that shattered instantly, followed by the savory, nutty richness of the leaf lard. The filling was a complex burst of high-acidity apple, perfectly balanced by the extra sugar. It wasn't just sweet, it was complete. The flavor profile was clean, focused, and deep. It was the absolute truth of a North Fork russet, translated into a pie. Elara laughed, a short, sharp sound of triumph. She hadn't just baked a pie, she had debugged a recipe. She had taken the chaotic, analog inputs of the local watershed, the heritage pig fat, the ancient tart apple, and created a verifiable, repeatable, optimized output. She had the recipe. Now she just had to survive the rest of the community integration, hosting the pie bake-off itself. And she needed to present her own pie, not just to the judges, but to Dale Thorne. The fate of the Greenprint rested on this perfect, lard-based kernel of tradition and optimization.